So my name is Caroline Courtney. I use she and her pronouns. I am the Europe Content Manager at Amnesty International. I've been working there for about 5 years now. And when I started with a few friends, we started the organizations within our international secretariat, the first LGBT staff initiative. So we've been kind of organizing and working on projects like Transclusive Language guidelines to try and get, even a place like Amnesty International to be more inclusive in its practices and language, not just for trans people, although that is definitely a main focus of our group at the moment, particularly here in the UK. So a few months ago, it's almost a few years ago now, we saw a real need within the work that Amnesty does to create a set of language guidelines and the way that we communicate externally in a way that's, it still conveys our message very clearly and it's not too clunky in language, but it is also very inclusive of trans and non-binary people. So I'll go into a little bit to what I mean by all of that. So I'll start with the assumption that all of the words I'm using are completely new to you. Some of you, this will be, old information, but I'll just start from the very beginning. What do we mean by trans inclusive language? Some people are cisgender and other people are transgender. So when I use the term cisgender or cis, C-I-S, not S-I-S, cisgender means that you are the gender that you were assigned by a doctor when you were born. So when I was born, I was told that I was a woman or I would grow up to be a woman, and I'd use the term woman to identify myself. So I'm cisgender. Now, if you identify with any other gender aside from the one that you were assigned at birth, then that would mean that you're transgender. Now, this is a bit of a point of contention, I think. No, I wouldn't say too much contention, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're using the term trans to include quite a wide variety of people that have different relationships with gender and use different terms to talk about their gender identity. So we're going to use it as an umbrella term for people who are transgender. So that includes trans women and trans men, people who are non-binary, so people who don't identify with either the term male or female, agendered people. So it's another way to talk about it's another way to say non-binary, but without focusing on the binary of male and female as part of the term to describe themselves. And a few others are genderqueer, gender neutral, and other gender non-conforming people. So there's lots of different relationships that people have with gender, and they use different terms. So I just wanted to make that really clear that for the purpose of this presentation and for the guidelines that me and my team put together, we're going to use the word trans as an umbrella term, but I just don't want to exclude anyone who uses other terms. These principles can still apply to them as well. And yeah, again, it's important to remember that everyone, including cis people, have their own relationship to how gender works in society. So people may prefer different terminology. So a lot of the guidelines in this are generally what people tend to prefer, but you should never assume, there might be people who disagree. I think that that's the whole purpose of having these guidelines, is to teach people to listen, to go into these conversations maybe a little bit more confidently than they would otherwise, and being able to, ask people what terminology they prefer when talking about their identity. So, yeah, when in doubt, just ask. If you meet someone and you don't know what pronouns they prefer, you can ask them, and that should be normalized. As a cis person, I'm asked all the time what my pronouns are, and that's a great thing. So it shouldn't just be the kind of thing that if you think that someone might be trans, you only ask pronouns. Then you can ask anyone their pronouns, you can ask everyone their pronouns, and that really should just be a normalized thing. I should say with asking people, make sure that you do it in a way that's not calling them out. I think that's an important distinction. We do sort of say, just ask anytime. Obviously, if you're doing it in a way where it's sort of saying, calling them out, specifically, what are your pronouns? I think that is probably something we'd want to avoid. Obviously, be polite and things like that. The same way that you might ask someone, okay, what's the right way of pronouncing your name? You wouldn't just interrupt a conversation to ask that. So I think it's important to remember to be polite, but also don't be feel uncomfortable asking. So just a little bit on why all of this is so important. So obviously these guidelines are specifically talking about the language that we use. So pronouns are a big part of that. There's other parts that we'll get onto. but language doesn't actually, doesn't really change society. And I think the argument that we definitely make in these guidelines is that it does. It shapes the way we think. There's lots of studies saying that, people who speak, Russian, they think differently than people who, are native English speakers. I think that that's something that we kind of understand across different languages. But I think that when it comes to within the English language, the language that we use, makes people visible. So we remember that they exist. So we don't forget them later on when it actually comes to, making decisions that might impact trans people negatively. So when we only use language that accounts for two genders, we make people who don't fit into those two very narrow categories invisible. So we essentially say, we're not talking to you, we're only talking to people who only identify as male or female or only identify as cisgender. I think this is especially poignant and important within the trans community, because trans people experience systematic oppression no matter where you are in the world. And this is becoming a big issue here in the UK, where I'm based. There's lack of access to healthcare. There's lack of legal recognition of their gender. Trans people and non-binary people are more likely to have trouble finding access to housing, employment, and education due to gross discrimination against them, and very high levels of harassment and violence. I think that the amount of bullying and harassment, I think there's a lot of focus on the way that, the experience of trans children at school, and the way that harassment, it's not only coming from their peers, but in some cases also coming from their teachers and parents as well. So I think it's really important to highlight how stressful it can be to exist under that kind of oppression. And I do also just want to really highlight the intersectional aspect of the fact that trans people who are Black, undocumented, or disabled, or experience other forms of intersectional identities, that they are going to face multiple forms of discrimination and oppression, and are at an even higher risk of violence and discrimination. So in the context of all of this happening, this is why it's important that we make the very small changes to the language and terminology that we use. So I just wanted to run through really quickly. These are the colleagues that I worked on this with. I definitely did not work on this on my own. We had a really nice collection of people, including interpreters and translators, who also helped us create a Spanish and French version of these guidelines, as well as people working in campaigns and gender identity. So some basic principles for using trans-inclusive language is, just ask yourself a few questions. Is my language cis-normative? Am I assuming that everyone in the room that I'm speaking to is either male or female, or identify as cisgender, and only people who are cisgender are in the room? If I were to walk into this room and say, ladies and gentlemen, that would be quite cis-normative because it's assuming that you are either a lady or a gentleman. Might someone who's not cisgender feel excluded by my language? Now, this is something I think that was really big at Amnesty. So we do a lot of work on abortion rights and access to abortion. And a lot of times when talking about those issues, we would talk about it being a women's rights issue. So we would use the term women to talk about people who need access to abortion. Now, they might not seem obvious, but non-binary people can get pregnant too. Trans men can get pregnant too. And their access to abortion was also a key thing that we needed to be highlighting in our work. So they were feeling excluded by our communications because we were just saying women. Have I referred to people with the name and pronouns? Have I asked them? Again, if you don't know, just ask. Or ask someone that knows them, that kind of thing. Pay attention to the terminology that people use to talk about themselves. They might, use the term person instead of woman. So that might be an indicator that maybe they are non-binary and you might need to change your language. And this is a big one. Is their gender or transness, is that relevant to what it is that I'm trying to say? So I've actually got a question in the chat here, which is quite relevant to this. In the context of this presentation, I'm presenting to a group of people on trans-inclusive language guidelines. The gender of the people that I'm speaking to is not super important at the moment, unless someone wants to, to tell me what their gender pronouns are. So, in terms, if I was to sort of saying, hello, everyone, that sort of thing, I think there's lots of very creative and kind of examples of saying, ladies, gentlemen, and I'm blanking on terms at the moment, but folks is a really good one. So yeah, there's lots of different terminology that you can use, but I just use everyone. I'm born in the southern United States. I love the word y'all. Y'alls is har y'all. Best gender neutral term, or at least one of my favorite ones. So that's some other ones that you can do. So I did want to run through a few examples of just some of the things that are in our guidelines, just kind of basic things on things to avoid, what you should use instead, and why that's important. So this is a big one. The term transsexual used to be used a lot more often. Nowadays, people generally just don't like using it. So we use the word transgender instead. A lot of people can find the word transsexual quite rude. It's inaccurate. When we're talking about sex, it's one thing. When we're talking about gender, it's another. So if someone is transgender, if they identify as their gender as a woman or a man or a non-binary, that is their gender and not their sex necessarily. It's important to recognize that historically people have used the term transsexual and still use the term transsexual. So some of you may be familiar with Marsha P. Johnson, who founded STAR, which was the Street Transvestites Advocacy something. Oh, I'm blanking on the whole acronym. But anyways, she used the term transvestite, which is something that is generally not considered very appropriate to what what transgender people prefer. But it was the term that she used for herself. So if that's the term that she would be using, then you still respect that and don't tell her what words to describe herself as a transgender person or a transsexual person. So another thing, kind of gone into this, talking about the ladies and gentlemen thing. A lot of times we see he/she, men and women, men, women, and children. Instead, use words that are actually relevant to what it is that you're saying. We found that in Amnesty's communications, we would say, a bunch of men and women showed up to a protest. The fact that they're men and women wasn't really that relevant. They were activists showing up to a protest, or they were students showing up to a protest. That actually conveys way more information than, trying to say that they might be all men and women. So try and avoid those kind of binary one or the other categories, and actually try and find words that describe what these people, are doing in a relevant way to what you're trying to communicate. This is a really big one. This is to avoid both women and trans women. Human rights defenders face increasing threat of violence. Now, this dichotomy kind of implies that trans women are not women and trans women are women, trans men are men. So if it's relevant to talk about the transness of these trans women human rights defenders, then we would say so in that context. So we would say women human rights defenders face threat to violence. And then if there's something that's specifically about trans women that does not apply to cisgender women, then we would then use the term trans to describe them. But we wouldn't just, if there's a trans woman, you don't have to put that trans label on there all the time, especially if you're comparing them to cisgender women. Hassan, who identifies as a man, has lived in the UK for 10 years. Hassan doesn't just identify as a man, Hassan is a man. If Hassan is a trans man, then that is the terminology that we use. So, if it's relevant to talk about Hassan's transness, then we can talk about how he is a trans man. But if we're just identifying him in the context of something completely separate, if we're saying that he identifies as a trans man and lives in the UK for 10 years, he's just a man. Previously known as John, Precious is a trans rights activist from Uganda. This is a term called dead naming. So if you use the name that someone was born with, but that they're no longer using, that's not their name, then even just bringing it up in the context of this is the name they used to have is dead naming and considered it incredibly disrespectful of someone's own identity. If we're talking about Precious in this situation, Precious is a trans activist from Uganda. We don't need to, it's never important to tell anyone what Precious's name was, before she started, people started calling her Precious. So that's a really big one. This is big, especially in Amnesty's work when talking about Chelsea Manning, who we were campaigning for a while. When we started campaigning for Chelsea Manning, it was before she came out as a trans woman. So we needed to make sure that when she came out, we changed all of our comms to be appropriate to saying Chelsea is a woman. So that's important to put that distinction in. This is a big one, and this is kind of going into that idea of intersectionality. and making sure that when we're trying to make trans people more visible and more respected in the language that we use, that we're not then harming another group of people who face systematic oppression. So something that we, there are lots of quotes of saying, trans people are not mad, they're not crazy, they know who they are. This is disrespectful to people who do suffer from mental health conditions. So we don't want to put in any sort of connotation that having a mental health condition or using stigmatizing words around mental health to have a negative connotation, that's not a good thing to do either, even though it's trying to explain something about the trans experience, especially when it comes to the the medicalization of trans identity. We also don't want to be discriminating against other groups. So being trans is not the same as having a medical health condition. Saying it in a way that is not using stigmatizing words. This is one of my favorite ones. So we'll all be familiar with this symbol over here, the Venus symbol. It means woman, and it's used as the feminist symbol. And I've never actually known if it's supposed to talk about gender or if it's supposed to talk about sex. So I find it actually quite a difficult visual image to use sometimes. But in I mentioned some of the work that Amnesty had done on reproductive rights and access to abortion. So this symbol is being used a lot within those movements. And we thought that it was quite harmful in a way because it was making people who can get pregnant who aren't women feel a little bit invisible, and also does the same to cisgender women who can't get pregnant, to trans women who can't get pregnant. What we're really talking about when we're talking about reproductive justice, if we're talking about anyone who can get pregnant. And I think that that's important to make that very clear distinction in our visual imagery as well as verbal and textual communication. So this is a big one that I wanted to put in as well. So to kind of sum it up, I know that there's a lot of talk around here about trans-inclusive language being very difficult. You hear about the gender ideology and it being very academic. And I think what we really were trying to do with this project is really explain to people that it's not that complicated, and that actually to make the world a better place for trans people and to be more inclusive of trans people is actually to liberate a lot of cis people from some of the constraints of gender as well. So don't let the fear of getting things wrong stop you from trying. This isn't, language evolves all the time. We're never expected to be able to keep up with all of it. If any of you speak a second language, you can definitely relate to, if there's specific regional dialects, people are going to prefer different things. And the only way that you can kind of overcome that is, again, by just asking people, what's the right way for me to be doing this? And I think that vulnerability is really important. So I've gone a little bit over time. I'm ready to open up for questions now, if anyone has any.
Hey, hi.
Hi, Rachel.
Hey, I thought I'd join you. Yeah, let us know if you've got any questions. I think I've got one for you. I think thanks for that. I think obviously somebody sort of asked whether the slides are available more widely, because I think a lot of organisations could do with it. And I think most organisations are cis-normative, aren't they? And I think there's a long way to go. So what would you say that if you're a cis person that you can do to help, I suppose, within an organisation?
Really good question. And this was something that we, there were lots of other projects within our organization that we kind of had around this. Really small things like putting your pronouns in your signature, email signature, putting it in your profile on social media. I think that when we only expect trans people to do that, then they're outing themselves by doing that, and we're making it more uncomfortable for them to do that. So as cis people, we should be doing it as well. And also recognizing that cis people get misgendered, as well. So, it does just make things more clear. Do you put your own pronouns out there when you start a meeting and you're meeting new people, introduce yourself with your pronouns. Small things like that, I think, make a massive difference, and it gets people who wouldn't otherwise be thinking about these issues to then be like, oh, why's Caroline done that? And it gets people to kind of think a bit more comprehensively.
Yeah. And then I think somebody's asked a question about whether there's any kind of books or reading that you recommend as well.
Yeah, so actually when we launched these guidelines at Amnesty, we had someone called Meg John Barker, who is an author and speaker and just overall brilliant person based in the UK. and they have a few comic books or graphic novels that I would highly recommend. You know, for all ages, just really great. Yeah, so Meg John Barker is one that I would definitely recommend. In terms of other writers, we've also had Travis Alabanza, who's also based in the UK, and they are a poet and performance artist that has a lot of really great stuff out there. Would definitely recommend that. And then also Alok Ved Manon is someone else who I'd also recommend. Okay,
cool. Well, if anybody got any more questions, or we'll let Caroline go, but it was fantastic. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I think everybody's excellent comments are there. So thanks so much for being a part of it.
Great. And I can share the presentation with you as well if you'd like that.
Yeah, that would be unreal. Yeah, if you could, I'll share it. Yeah, that would be good.
Fantastic.
All right. Okay. Cheers, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.